On a typical day in a quiet Nebraska town, the Burpo family's world was turned upside down when their young son, Colton, nearly lost his life in a medical emergency. What happened next was nothing short of a miracle. As Colton awoke, he began recounting vivid, astonishing details of an incredible journey beyond the grave. He spoke of heavenly visions, encounters with angels, and even meeting Jesus himself. But it wasn't just a peaceful glimpse of paradise. Colton returned with a message that would leave his family, and everyone who heard it, stunned. A message far more unsettling than they could ever have imagined. This is the story of a boy who came back from death with a terrifying message from heaven. A revelation that challenges everything we think we know about life, death, and what might lie beyond. In January of 2003, in the quiet town of Imperial, Nebraska, life for the Burpo family was about to change in ways they could never have imagined. The small, close-knit community knew the Burpos well. Todd, the local pastor, Sonia, the busy schoolteacher, and their two children, Colton and Cassie. Like many families in the area, they led a modest, faith-driven life, filled with the ordinary hustle of family, work, and community. Todd, a man of many roles, was not only a pastor but also a volunteer firefighter, a coach, and a handyman, always juggling a full schedule. But despite his busy life, Todd was a devoted father and husband. Sonia, equally dedicated, balanced her teaching career with the care of her children. At just 4 years old, Colton was the embodiment of youthful energy and curiosity. His wide smile and blonde hair made him instantly endearing, and he was always asking questions, eager to learn about the world around him. He had a special bond with his father, often tagging along with Todd on errands and imitating his every move. Life was busy, yes, but it was good, and the Burpos were content. Then, one day, a seemingly minor illness began to shake their world. Colton, like many young children, came down with what appeared to be a simple stomach virus. At first, there was nothing alarming, just a fever, some stomach pain, and the discomfort that seemed typical for a flu. Todd and Sonia thought nothing of it, believing their son would soon recover. But as days passed, Colton's condition grew worse. His pain intensified, and soon he was crying out in agony, clutching his small stomach. Something wasn't right. Sonia's maternal instinct kicked in. These cries were unlike anything she'd heard before. They weren't the usual discomfort of a sick child. These cries were desperate. Frightened, she insisted they take Colton back to the doctor. But even then, the family doctor couldn't find anything seriously wrong. He diagnosed it as a bad case of the stomach flu and advised them to keep Colton hydrated and wait it out. Todd, trying to reassure his wife, urged calm, but deep down, a troubling feeling gnawed at him. Something was terribly wrong. As the days passed, Colton's pain became unbearable. He could barely stand without screaming, his little body racked with agony. The situation was no longer just worrying. It was terrifying. Sonia called Todd at work one afternoon, her voice quivering with panic. "Todd, something's wrong." "This isn't normal," she said, barely holding back tears. "We need to take him back to the doctor." Todd felt a surge of dread unlike anything he had ever known. He rushed home, and together they sped back to the doctor's office, hearts racing. This time, the doctor saw the gravity of the situation. Colton's condition had deteriorated rapidly, and it was clear that immediate action was needed. The doctor urged them to take Colton to the hospital without delay. As they drove to the Great Plains Regional Medical Center, Todd and Sonia's minds were clouded with fear. Colton lay pale and limp in the back seat, his eyes glazed with pain. The drive felt endless, each moment heavy with the weight of uncertainty. In the silence of the car, all they could do was pray. When they arrived at the hospital, the emergency team rushed Colton in. Tests were run, and the results were shocking. Colton's appendix had ruptured, something the family doctor had missed during the initial examination. The toxins from the burst appendix had already begun to spread through his body, triggering a severe infection. The doctors looked grave. Colton's situation was critical. They needed to operate immediately if there was any chance of saving him. Sonia, overwhelmed by the sudden turn of events, broke down in tears. Just days earlier, they had been dealing with what they thought was a routine illness, and now they were faced with the terrifying reality that their son's life was hanging by a thread. Todd tried to stay strong for his wife and daughter, but inside, his world was crumbling. How had it come to this? How had a simple stomachache turned into a life-or-death crisis? The fear in his heart was palpable, but there was no time to dwell on it, only the desperate hope that the doctors could save their precious boy. Todd's heart was breaking. He wanted to scream, to cry out to God, to beg for his son's life, but he couldn't. He held it together, knowing he had to stay strong for his family. He bent down and kissed Colton's forehead, his voice thick with emotion, as he whispered, "I love you, buddy." Colton, barely conscious, managed a faint smile, and, with a softness that was both heartbreaking and precious, whispered back, "I love you too, Daddy." The surgery was grueling and lasted far longer than expected. Todd couldn't sit still. He paced the waiting room, his thoughts scattered and his prayers lost in a blur. Words failed him. All he could do was silently plead with God, tears streaming down his face as he thought about all the moments he might lose with his son. The games they hadn't played, the questions Colton still had, the future they had dreamed of. He had never felt so utterly helpless. Meanwhile, Colton was fighting for his life. His tiny body, already weakened by the infection ravaging his abdomen, was struggling to survive. The surgical team worked frantically to remove the toxins, their movements desperate, their focus intense. At one point, Colton's heart rate dropped dangerously low, and the medical team feared they might lose him. It was a moment of sheer terror. They fought desperately to save him, but time seemed to be running out. And then, something extraordinary happened. Colton, though unconscious on the operating table, later described what he had experienced during those critical moments. He spoke as if he had stepped outside of his body, floating above the scene, watching the surgeons work frantically to save him. He saw the beads of sweat on the doctor's brows, the intensity in their eyes, and the urgency in their hands. Detached yet aware, he floated in a strange, surreal calm as he watched the struggle for his life unfold. At the same time, Colton said he saw his parents in the waiting room. He described his mother crying as she spoke to family on the phone, her voice trembling with panic. He saw his father in another corner of the room, pacing, head bowed, deep in prayer. Colton could feel his father's anguish, his fear, though he was physically far from him. It was an experience so detailed, so vivid, it left Todd and Sonia in stunned silence. How could their 4-year-old son describe something so precise, so clear, when he had been unconscious under anesthesia? When Colton finally woke from surgery, his parents' relief was palpable, though they were still haunted by the uncertainty. The doctors couldn't promise Colton was out of danger. The road to recovery was fraught with risk, and the fear of complications loomed large. As the days passed and Colton regained his strength, he began to share strange details about his experience. At first, it seemed innocent enough. He mentioned, almost casually, that he had been able to watch his parents during the surgery. Todd and Sonia exchanged bewildered glances. "What do you mean you watched us?" they asked. Colton responded simply, "I saw you in the waiting room." He described exactly where they had been standing, what they had been doing, and even snippets of their conversation. The couple listened in stunned silence. How could Colton know these things? He had been under anesthesia, his body fighting for survival. The things he described, details of their actions and words in the waiting room, were impossible for him to know. It was as if the very fabric of reality had shifted beneath their feet. Their son, who had been near death, was describing moments that seemed impossible to explain. Then, Colton shared something that left them breathless. "I went up to heaven," he said, his eyes wide and sincere, as though it was the most natural thing in the world. "I saw Pop," he added, his face lighting up with a smile that spoke of pure joy. Sonia's breath caught in her throat. "Pop?" she asked, unsure she had heard him right. "You mean my dad?" Colton nodded enthusiastically. "Yes, he was really happy to see me," he said, describing the man he had met in heaven. He spoke of his smile, the warmth in his eyes, and how he felt a deep sense of love and peace. The description was so vivid, so specific, that it made Sonia's heart race. But there was something even more startling. The man Colton described didn't match any of the recent photos she had of her father. How could he know what her father looked like? How could he possibly recognize him? The mystery deepened with each passing day, as Colton's words about heaven continued to spill out, not in a single story, but in snippets, little glimpses into a world beyond their understanding. And as they listened, Todd and Sonia were faced with an overwhelming truth. Their son had crossed over, and in doing so, had returned with a message, one that shook everything they thought they knew about life, death, and the mysteries of the beyond. Had been talking about, but the description stuck with him. Big, strong hands, a smile that radiated warmth. He pressed Colton for more details, trying to understand who this mysterious figure could be. But Colton simply repeated the same words, his tone filled with innocent certainty. "He said he loved me," Colton added. "And he smiled a lot." The details didn't seem to make sense at first. Who could this man be? It wasn't until much later, when Todd began to reflect more deeply on the experiences Colton was sharing, that he made a chilling realization. The man Colton had described, the big, strong hands, the loving smile, wasn't a stranger at all. It was Jesus. Todd's heart skipped a beat. Could it be? Could his son, in his innocent, untainted way, have encountered Jesus himself? It felt almost too much to comprehend. Colton's simple, childlike descriptions, laced with such profound love, began to open a door to a reality Todd had never fully imagined. Was it possible that his son had truly crossed over to the other side? That in the midst of his battle for life, Colton had seen and experienced things no one on earth could fully understand. Colton's encounters with heaven didn't stop there. As the days passed, he shared more vivid details, each one as surreal and awe-inspiring as the last. He spoke of a place filled with unimaginable light, of colors that didn't belong to the earthly spectrum, shades so vibrant they defied description. He described hearing music. Not just any music, he insisted, but a harmony so beautiful, so pure. It filled him with a joy and peace he had never known. The light, he explained, wasn't like the sunlight they were used to. It came from everything around him, glowing in a way that was more profound than any earthly illumination. Then, one quiet afternoon, as Colton lay resting, he mentioned something else that took his parents by surprise. "I met my sister," he said, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Sonia froze. Cassie, their living daughter, was in school, so it couldn't have been her. "What do you mean?" Sonia asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "I met my other sister," Colton explained, his eyes bright with the certainty of a child recounting a memory. Sonia's face went pale. The room seemed to close in around her. How could Colton know this? How could he speak of a sister they had never told him about? Years before Colton was born, Sonia had suffered a miscarriage. A deep and painful loss that she and Todd rarely spoke of, not even to each other. It was a part of their past that had never been shared with Colton. But here he was, speaking about it as though it were a memory he himself had lived. Tears sprang to Sonia's eyes. What did she look like? She asked, her voice trembling. Colton smiled softly. "She had dark hair like yours, Mommy," he said, his voice full of warmth. "And she was really, really happy." He paused, looking up at her with a look of pure sincerity. She hugged me and said she couldn't wait for you to come to heaven someday." Sonia felt as if the world had dropped away beneath her feet. The grief she had buried so deep for so many years came rushing to the surface all at once. She broke down, tears streaming down her face. It was as if her lost child had been found again, a little girl she had never known she would meet. Todd held her tightly, feeling the weight of everything she was experiencing. He, too, was shaken to his core. They had both mourned privately, silently, and here was Colton, saying things no child his age could possibly know. It felt as though their child had brought them a message from the beyond, a message that both healed and unsettled them. Colton didn't understand why his parents were crying. "She's okay," he said with the simple certainty only a child could possess. "She's not sad. She loves you both so much." Sonia's heart twisted. Those words were everything she had ever longed to hear, yet never dared to hope for. If what Colton was saying was true, their lost child was not lost at all. She was safe, happy, and waiting for them in a place filled with love. For Todd, this revelation stirred something deep inside. He had always tried to reconcile his faith with the struggles and doubts that plagued him. As a pastor, he had spent countless hours comforting others, preaching about God's love and the promise of heaven. But secretly, there had always been a part of him that struggled to believe it, with the same unwavering certainty he preached to his congregation. But Colton's words, the clarity and innocence with which he spoke, filled Todd with something profound. This wasn't just a child's fantasy. This was a confirmation of everything Todd had been teaching others, but had never fully allowed himself to believe. It felt as though God was speaking directly to him, through his son. A glimpse into the divine plan. A reminder that life, even the smallest and most fragile, was part of something far greater. As Colton continued to share the visions and experiences he had encountered in heaven, Todd and Sonia found themselves on a journey unlike any they had ever imagined. It was a journey that raised more questions than answers. Yet, with every new story, every unexpected revelation, it also brought them a deep sense of peace, a peace that transcended understanding, and a comfort that only the mysteries of heaven could offer. Todd watched his son, eyes wide with curiosity, eager to hear more. "So what did he look like?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Colton looked up at him, his gaze soft but knowing. "It was Jesus," he said simply. "He's really nice, Daddy. He loves everyone." Todd's heart froze. He had taught his children about Jesus since they were old enough to understand, but hearing Colton speak of meeting him face to face was almost impossible to comprehend. "What did he look like?" Todd asked again, his voice barely steady. There was a tremor in his chest, something between awe and fear. Colton thought for a moment, as if searching for the right words. Then he spoke, each sentence more weighty than the last. "He had brown hair and a beard," Colton said softly, "and his eyes were like the ocean. They were full of love, like he knew everything about me. But he still loved me anyway." Todd was stunned. It was a description so simple, yet so profound. More than a child's innocent guess, more like an ancient truth being revealed. He couldn't speak at first, only staring at his son, his mind trying to piece together what this could mean. "What else?" Todd finally managed, almost afraid to hear more. Colton continued without hesitation. "He wore a white robe with a purple sash, and he had marks on his hands and feet." A chill ran down Todd's spine. Marks? He knew instantly what Colton meant. The scars from the nails, from the crucifixion. Todd's breath caught in his throat. Colton couldn't have known that detail. He was too young, too innocent, to understand the full meaning of those wounds. And yet, there he was, speaking of them with the matter-of-fact certainty of someone who had seen them. "What did Jesus say to you?" Todd asked, almost afraid to hear the answer. Colton paused, his face growing serious, as if recalling something very important. "He told me it wasn't my time yet," Colton said. his voice calm but with a weight that seemed to hang in the air. He said I had to go back because he had work for me to do. The words landed like a heavy, sacred truth. Todd pulled Colton into his arms, holding him tight, as if somehow the embrace could shield him from the enormity of what he had just said. They sat there, locked in a moment of stunned silence, feeling as though they were standing on the threshold of something that transcended their understanding, a place where the living world and the mysteries of the divine met. Sonia joined them, wrapping her arms around both of them, the three of them huddling together. The weight of Colton's words hung between them, a message too big for their hearts to fully grasp, but one that they knew was real, somehow in ways they couldn't explain. It was no longer just a story about a near-death experience, no longer just a terrifying moment when their son had slipped so close to the edge of life. It was something more, something sacred. It was a glimpse into heaven, a reminder that there was something beyond, something far greater than anything they had ever imagined. As Colton began to recover, the Burpo family found themselves changed in ways they hadn't expected. Yes, they were grateful beyond words that Colton had survived, but the weight of his story, a story he couldn't have made up, left them grappling with emotions that were as much unsettling as they were comforting. They had been through trauma, yes, but now there was something else. Something beyond the ordinary realm of human understanding. That was filling the space between them. Todd and Sonia were both deeply rooted in their faith, having read the Bible countless times, having lived their lives in the service of God. But hearing their son, their 4-year-old son, speak about meeting Jesus in heaven, it was overwhelming. It shook everything they thought they knew. This wasn't just a child's dream or a vivid imagination. It was something real. Something realer than anything they had ever known. Days passed, and the story unfolded slowly, piece by piece, like a puzzle whose pieces kept surprising them. It wasn't as though Colton sat them down to deliver his experience all at once. It came in bits and pieces, in quiet moments, during everyday conversations. One evening, as Todd tucked Colton into bed, the boy looked up at him with wide, serious eyes. "Daddy?" Colton asked softly. "Do you know how much Jesus loves the children?" Todd was caught off guard by the question. It wasn't like the usual bedtime musings. This felt different. "Yes, buddy, I know," Todd answered, smiling gently. Colton, though, wasn't satisfied. "No, Daddy. He really loves them," he insisted, his voice taking on a deep, earnest tone. "He told me." Todd felt a rush of emotions that he couldn't quite identify. He had spent years preaching about Jesus' love for children, but hearing it from his own son, someone who seemed to have been touched by that love in ways beyond his comprehension, was something else entirely. It was a truth, a deep truth, that came from a place beyond words. It was humbling, and it left Todd feeling both comforted and unsettled, as if the divine mystery that he had spent his whole life preaching about had just stepped into their lives in a way that was almost too personal to bear. Sonia, still processing everything, began to watch Colton more closely. She listened more intently when he spoke about his experience. There was no hesitation in his voice, no sign of embellishment or imagination. He spoke as though he had simply been on a trip that had left him more certain of the world to come than anyone she had ever known. One afternoon, as they sat together on the porch, Sonia asked, "Colton, what else did you see in heaven?" The moment she asked, his face lit up with a wide grin. "I saw lots of animals," he said excitedly. "There were all kinds of horses. They had really bright colors." Sonia smiled, trying to imagine the scene. But then Colton added something that made her pause. "Jesus had a rainbow horse," he said simply. "A rainbow horse." Sonia's heart skipped. It was a detail so childlike, so full of innocence and imagination. Yet there was something in Colton's tone, something that made her understand that this wasn't just a figment of his imagination. He was describing what he had seen. As Colton's story spread among their church community, people were captivated. They listened, fascinated and moved by the simple, profound details that this child shared. Some felt awe, others disbelief, but there was no denying the sincerity in Colton's voice. His words were more than just a story. They were a glimpse into something beyond this world, something mysterious, something holy. And for the Burpo family, it was the beginning of a journey into the unknown, a journey that would test their faith, stretch their understanding, and ultimately transform the way they saw the world forever. As Colton's story spread, it struck a chord with many. Those who had experienced loss or struggled with doubts about their faith found unexpected comfort in the boy's account of heaven. His words, spoken with the innocence of a child yet with a profound certainty, seemed to offer reassurance, a glimpse into something beyond this life that was filled with love, peace, and joy. The idea that a child, untouched by the cynicism of adulthood, had seen the afterlife and returned with such a message of hope was undeniably powerful. It gave people a sense of peace they hadn't felt in years. But as the story spread, not everyone embraced it. Skepticism began to creep in, even from those who had known the Burpo family for years. Some of Todd's fellow pastors listened politely but couldn't hide their discomfort. They were trying to reconcile Colton's words with their own understanding of theology, their own rigid frameworks of what was possible. Others suggested that it might simply have been a vivid dream, brought on by the anesthesia, or perhaps a child's way of processing the trauma he had endured. One friend even hinted that it could just be Colton's imagination running wild after hearing so many Bible stories. Todd understood the doubts. He had struggled with them himself. When Colton first began speaking of his experiences, Todd had wrestled with his own skepticism, unsure of what to make of it all. But the more he listened to his son, the more he knew something extraordinary had happened. He could see it in Colton's eyes, in the way the boy spoke. This wasn't a child making up a fanciful story. This was a child speaking from a place of deep, inexplicable truth. And Todd couldn't dismiss it, no matter how much part of him might want to. It wasn't just the details of Colton's experience that were striking. It was the way his entire demeanor had changed. Colton, once a typical, playful child, now seemed older, wiser in a way that went beyond his years. There was a quiet certainty about him, a calmness that Todd had never seen before, as if the boy had crossed into a realm of understanding far beyond his age. It was as if, in some mysterious way, Colton had touched eternity and returned with a message that couldn't be ignored. Eventually, Todd and Sonia realized they had no choice but to share Colton's story more widely. It wasn't about seeking attention or trying to convince others. It was about spreading the message that had been entrusted to their son. The story was too powerful to keep to themselves. And so, they made the decision to write a book, a task that felt both daunting and overwhelming. Todd had spent years speaking from the pulpit, addressing large congregations, but writing their family's most personal experiences for the world to read felt different. It required a level of vulnerability he hadn't expected. Still, they felt a deep responsibility. They believed Colton had been given this experience for a reason, and it was their duty to help him share it. The process of writing the book, Heaven is for Real, was cathartic, yet challenging. As they wrote, Todd and Sonia relived not only the trauma of nearly losing Colton, but also the incredible moments of revelation that followed. They laughed, cried, and prayed together as they pieced together the narrative, with Colton now a little older, offering corrections and adding details. "No, Daddy," he would say, shaking his head. "It wasn't like that. It was brighter there. There was more light." When the book was finally published, the response was overwhelming. It quickly became a bestseller, resonating with readers across the country and beyond. People from all walks of life, devout Christians, agnostics, and even those who had long abandoned the idea of an afterlife, found themselves moved by Colton's simple yet profound account. His words, full of childlike wonder, made it impossible to dismiss. This wasn't a theological argument or abstract belief. It was an unfiltered story from a young boy who claimed he had seen heaven and met Jesus. As the book's popularity grew, the Burpo family was invited to speak at churches, conferences, and community events. Colton, still just a child, found himself standing in front of hundreds, sometimes thousands, of people recounting his experience. But he didn't seem nervous. Instead, he spoke with a quiet confidence that left audiences in awe. He described the colors, the animals, the angels singing, and the overwhelming sense of love he had felt. Some listeners cried, others whispered prayers of gratitude, and many clung to every word as if it were a lifeline, desperate for hope, desperate for a glimpse of something beyond the here and now. Not everyone, of course, believed. There were still skeptics, those who couldn't accept the story as anything other than a vivid imagination, a byproduct of a traumatic experience. But for many, Colton's account was far more than a story. It was a glimpse into the divine, a message from beyond. One evening, after a particularly moving event, Colton came to his parents with a serious expression, his small hands gripping their arms. "I saw something," he said, his voice soft but urgent. "It was like a door, but not a door. It was more like a window. And through it, I saw something. But it's not for now. It's not for you to know yet." Todd and Sonia exchanged a look, the weight of his words hanging in the air. They knew, deep down, that their son had touched something beyond comprehension, something still veiled. And though they didn't press him further, they couldn't shake the feeling that Colton's story, their story, was still unfolding, revealing only pieces at a time, as if the mysteries of heaven were not fully meant to be understood, at least not yet. And as the Burpo family continued on their journey, they couldn't help but wonder, was this all there was to Colton's experience? Or was there more, waiting just beyond the veil, a story yet to be told?